European football. Angels with Dirty Faces, that's about the footballing history of Argentina. The Names Heard Long Ago, which is about the golden age of Hungarian football and how it shaped the modern game. The Outsider, History of the Goalkeeper. You've also written a novel and a couple of biographical works as well. So Brian Clough biography, and then a book which has just come out, we're going to talk about a little bit later, Two Brothers, The Life and Lives of Bobby and Jackie Charlton. But the book that we're going to focus on mainly today, Inverting the Pyramid, which I suppose is your seminal work. I suppose it's the thing that you're best known for. Looking forward to having a good chat about that today. That was released in 2008, and then there was a second edition which came out in 2014. But it's obviously well over 10 years since you first published Inverting the Pyramid. So maybe to start with, just a retrospective look on how do you feel about Inverting the Pyramid looking back after all that time?
I mean, I sort of now realise that I'd spent a lot of time. Yeah, people say how long does it take to write? Well, it took 10 months, which is ridiculous. But there'd been sort of 10 years before that, 15, 20 years before that, when I've been thinking about those themes, thinking about those topics. I think I was profoundly lucky to catch a wave of rising interest in tactics. And that book it's become this sort of source material that lots of my other books are sort of tributaries from that. Here's a detail that didn't quite make sense at the time. How can I go into more detail about it? How can I explain that more? And it's still, it still brings in money every year. So it's a very good thing to have done. And there was a third edition as well, and Touchwood will be a fourth edition next year. So every 5 years is the plan. But still buy it now. Don't wait till next year, because we don't know for absolutely certain that's happening. I know that is the thing. It is sort of infinitely updatable and revisable. It's the revisions as well. It's not just sticking a chapter on the end. It's when you realise, oh yeah, I didn't quite get that right, or you suddenly realise. I mean, I think the second edition suddenly had to go back and fill in loads of details on Spanish football in the 1920s, because to explain Barcelona. Yes, the first book came out in 2008, so Guardiola hadn't even been appointed at Barcelona at that point. And Guardiola's probably the most important thing to happen in football tactics since the early 70s, since Cruyff first came along. But to explain him, you have to create the context. You then have to go back and you explain what the circumstances of Spanish football were before him.
You mentioned the context there before Inverting the Pyramid. You obviously were thinking about football tactics at that point. We'll talk a little bit more about the sort of prompts that led you to write the book, but where were you at before Inverting the Pyramid in terms of tactics writing? Was it something you were consciously doing, or was it just something that was the way that you wrote about football at the time?
I think I mentioned in the intro of Inverting the Pyramid, it was during year 2004 when I was working for the FT. And the FT, in their wisdom to save money, decided to have journalists share rooms, which is just a terrible, terrible idea. So there was some tension, shall we say, between me and the lad I was sharing with. He seems to have gone on to have an annoyingly great career, but never mind. There was 4 FT journalists out there in Portugal, and we were having tapas one night in Lisbon and got into this massive row about whether tactics mattered or not. I was very much on the side of yes. The lad I was sharing a room with very much on the side of no. I think it's fair to say he's not a football specialist. I sort of hadn't realised how strongly I felt about the importance of tactics. And the fact that you then realise that, that Galliano line, I don't particularly like Galliano, but that line, tell me how you play and I'll tell you who you are. And I think there's a profundity to that. And you realise, well, yeah, football tactics are the most obvious manifestation of how culture has an impact on football. You know, to play in a certain way, there have to be certain stimuli to make you think in that way. And I think people can take that too far. I think a lot of the talk of national styles can be pretty blunt stereotypes and are not necessarily particularly useful. In certain cases, as in Argentina in the 1920s, it's utterly self-conscious, and therefore it is really important and interesting. But if you're a coach, the way you look at football, the way you set about the winning of games, even if you think the winning of games is the most important thing or not, all of that is socially and culturally conditioned.
And do you feel as though that was a fairly representative position to be interested in tactics at those times, or were you in the minority at that point?
I think it was in the minority, but I think it was common. I mean, David Pleat had been doing his tactics column in The Guardian for a while, and he obviously had a certain popularity. I think you'd seen with Andy Gray on Sky going to greater depth than we'd gone into before. So, probably wasn't a minority among regular football writers, but I think they were very much sort of responding to football journalism, certainly pre the absolute takeover of the internet age, was a pretty conservative place. But I mean, I absolutely did not initiate it. It was on its way. I just happened to be the one who got there at the right time.
And in terms of what actually prompted you to write the book, how did the book come about in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to say there was some great sort of plan, but I'd written the book on Eastern European football behind the curtain, and I was in an office with my editor and my agent, and we were talking about what should I do next. That Behind the Curtain had been well reviewed. It had done relatively well in terms of sales, not brilliantly, but enough for them to be interested in doing another book. And we were knocking around some ideas. And I'd just done a big piece for 442 magazine, which I think might even been like 10,000 words. It ran over 2 issues on, I think it was the 10 key tactical innovations. And some of that had come from Behind the Curtain, that people like Lobanovsky are clearly hugely important in the development of tactics. And Hungary as well, with John centre forward and Šebeš and Bukovi and people like that. And so I said, maybe this is something that could be expanded into a book. And my editor had a few years earlier commissioned a writer from the Times called Peter Ball to write a history of tactics, and he died before he finished it. So he was already sold on the idea that this was something that was lacking. So as soon as I suggested that, he was like, yeah, definitely do that. So it was the second book I got a contract for, but then Sunderland were doing well under Roy Keane, and by chance the CEO of Orion is a Sunderland fan. And so he was very keen to do a book on Roy Keane and Sunderland. So that was sort of rushed out in between times. And then once I got going with the tactics book, it became a much bigger thing than I'd anticipated. I suddenly stopped thinking about the money and started saying, right, I've got to go to Kiev, I've got to go to Moscow, I've got to go to Germany, I've got to go to Austria, I've got to go to Sao Paulo and Rio and Buenos Aires, and I've got to do proper digging. And what I sort of found was that every country was pretty comfortable in its own tactical development, but nobody was really putting it into a more global sphere. Nobody was sort of joining the dots. So what the book really becomes is the story of how ideas travel. And what's great about that is it then becomes about the individuals who've made them travel. So I think when you talk about tactics writing, I'm not somebody who can look at a game and tell you instantly, why it's going. I might have an idea, but I'm not going to be able to go into granular detail straight away. And maybe even after watching it back 3 or 4 times, I might not have the granular detail that a real specialist in that has. But what I was interested in was the people who carried those ideas. And you then realise that actually the whole thing is to do with the rise of fascism and Hungarians and Austrians getting out, which then becomes the name so long ago. And it becomes, obviously now it's much more complex because the spread of information is much more, it's much freer and much quicker, and everything's not siloed in the way it was 100 years ago. Yeah,
and I want to talk about that a little bit later, actually. But before we do that, obviously the whole book, and I think the longevity of the book, hangs on that metaphor that you landed on, inverting the pyramid. This notion that you have these early front-loaded teams, and slowly through time, there's a realization that actually if you defend it can benefit you, and we see that migration of players backwards. That's obviously a really nice metaphor to tell the story through.
And it was a really nice metaphor in 2008. Things have got a lot more complicated since.
Right. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that more.
Yeah, I was even aware of that at the time, that this might not be the end point. I didn't want to sort of go all fucking arm at the end of history, which I even referred to, I think, in the...
Yeah, you do.
Because I was aware that was a danger. And what's really annoying is me and my agent had an idea for a much better title. And we were in the pub, and by the next morning, neither of us could remember it. And I rang him the next morning and was like, what was the idea we had? Oh, yeah, it was really, I don't know what it was. So there is somewhere in the ether a better title, but I don't know, nobody knows what it is.
There's an argument to be made, though, that the better title would have been a less successful title, right?
Well, possibly, yeah.
But I'm interested in how you arrived at that metaphor, because obviously that's the way that you're telling the story, and it becomes the framework in which you hang the history off. So was it something that arrived in an inspirational moment, or was it?
I think if you're doing a book like that, it could just be very episodic, which to an extent it is, isn't it? Naturally it is. But if you're trying to sort of create some overarching sort of thread running through, you're sort of thinking, well, we begin with 127 or 226 or 235 when people really start thinking about it for the first time. And by 2008, it looked like centre forwards were being refined out of existence, which was before Messi did it. That first book, the first edition of it, really ends with Totti doing it for Spalletti's Roma, and with United doing it with Ronaldo, Rooney, and Tevez sort of sharing that role. And what you now realise, or what I now realise, is that I totally underplayed the importance of Carlos Queiroz in that. And Queiroz is coming from this Portuguese school that has produced Queiroz to Vitor Freire, to Mourinho, to André Villas-Boas, to Marco Silva. Yeah, that's all linked to the Manchester United. And so the fascinating thing that I didn't go into in that book, which I really wish I had done, is Mourinho turns up in England in 2004, wins the league twice. And how does Ferguson topple that? He brings in the originator of the Portuguese school. He fights Portugal with Portugal. And that's the thing I think at the time none of us were really sort of conscious of. And I think probably now we would be more aware of that, because I think we're much more accepting of the role of assistant managers in generating styles and methods.
So
so the point was, we've gone from 2-3-5 to 5-3-2, or 4-4-1-1, or 4-3-3 non. So it seemed very obvious this has gone from being very attack heavy to very defence heavy. And if you take 2-3-5 to 5-3-2, it's a very nice sort of inversion.
And I guess once you've got that metaphor, you can just sort of write the history. So once you'd got this sort of idea of the inversion of the pyramid, was that easy to just write?
Yeah, I mean it's sort of a history sort of it's pretty easy to trace up till 1990ish. And I don't know whether it becomes harder to trace after that because the football gets more complex, or because we're still too close to really get the distance to sort of strip away the needless detail. But you see pretty obviously that we go from 2-3-5 to WM to 4-2-4 to 4-3-3 to 4-4-2 to Catenaccio sort of hanging around in that same era, to total football, to pressing in the Liverpool way of doing it, or the English way of doing it in the late 70s. Lobanovsky, another pressing really has the three avenues: the English, the Dutch, and the Soviet. And then I guess you get the Heiselbaum, which from an English point of view is sort of a dead end. And then you get, from early 80s onwards, the back three returning. Although the back three was around in Jim Smith used it, for instance. I think Sunderland used it under Len Asher for the 1985 League Cup final, which I hadn't realised. I interviewed David Corner, the bloke who made the mistake of letting Norwich score 2 or 3 years ago, and I was like, what was the system? I don't know, how does this work? And then spoke to David Corner, who was, it was a back three. But when Chelsea won the title under Conte in, when was that, 2017?
15 was Mourinho.
Yeah, and then Leicester 16. That was the first time anybody won the English league with a back three since Everton in 63.
I mean, yeah.
Which is, remarkable.
Yeah, I mean,
so the point being that story is pretty easy to trace. And you're looking at people know those individual stories, but you're looking at the transition. Why did it change? Who are the people who made that change?
What was the research process like? Because obviously a lot of these tactical ideas aren't being explicitly written about necessarily, right?
Well, they're not. They weren't in England. They absolutely were in Brazil or Italy or Germany. Yeah, the sort of reluctance to discuss tactics that for a long time we had here doesn't really exist elsewhere. And then there had been work done elsewhere. So to an extent, my job was synthesis and filling in the gaps. I guess any history is synthesis and filling in the gaps, unless you have some radical new detail. But the thing that I think was most significant in terms of sort of drawing it all out, and it was sort of a moment when I knew this sort of diagram that I'd drawn worked, was in Brazil. So Brazilian football, really up until late 30s, wasn't as dominant as it should have been in South America. They were very much the third power behind Argentina and Uruguay. And that begins to change, and this is pretty well attested in Brazilian histories, with the arrival of Dori Krishna at Flamengo in 1936. Except they called him Dori Krishna, and then So, okay, so he was Dory Kushner. Oh, we don't know. He was European. Right, but have you looked beyond that? And a couple of historians go, well, yeah, I've tried to find him, but he's just not in any records. He doesn't exist. And so there was a bloke called Roberto Saf, who's sort of the absolute doyen of historians of Flamengo, had written to, I think, the 5 Central European FAs saying, yeah, do you know who this bloke is? And they all replied, no. And then there's a radio journalist in Budapest, a mate of mine, said, are you sure it's Kushner, not Kushner? And the R and the other way around. And I don't know, why? Well, he's Dory Kushner. He went, no, he played for MTK, won 5 caps, and then he succeeded Jimmy Hogan at MTK in 1918 when Hogan returned to the UK. And suddenly you say, okay, everything falls into place, that Hogan is not merely the father of Central European football, he's a huge influence on Kushner, who's the father of Brazilian football, so Hogan then is the grandfather of Brazilian football. And that was a fact nobody had put together before. So that's a huge important thing in getting that sort of family tree sort of flowing out. What I then realised was there had to be an equivalent figure in Argentina. And I found him, and I think in the first edition, I referred to him as Emerico Herschel, because that's what he was called in Argentina. And I didn't really go into too much detail because I thought, well, it's just replicating what I said about Kushner in Brazil. But I then sort of, when I did the Argentina book, I thought I should, and this is what I mean about sort of picking up details, I thought I should investigate who is Emerico Herschel, why did he go to Argentina? And you realise that he actually doesn't exist. His name in German would be Emmerich Herschel, in Hungarian would be Imre Herschel, and he went by all 3, but he never played football. He lied. He said he did, and I found his daughter still living in Buenos Aires. She said, oh yeah, he had all these stories about how he played in Prague, and he played in Africa, and he played in India, and he played in Paris. He said, I just don't think he did. But you chased them all up, and no, he didn't play for any of them. And it turned out he was just a bluffer, but also a genius.
Yeah. I'm interested in your sense when you're writing it, that you were writing the definitive history of football tactics, and I guess you had choices to make about which coaches to include. How were you aware of that when you were writing that a lot of this is just to do with, I guess, your preference for certain coaches?
Yes and no. I mean, I got a lot of criticism when it came out for not including more on Wenger, for instance. Okay. But Wenger is clearly a great coach. I just don't think he was a particularly innovative coach. He was innovative in English terms, but I think what he was doing was pretty standard. So not all great coaches have to be innovators. I think the innovators stand out a lot. I mean, I got criticised in Germany for not really including many Germans. But again, I don't think until the modern age, and certainly post 2008, Germany's had a huge impact on how tactics have gone. But Germany was even their sort of version of total football. I'm slightly cautious of even using that term about them, but it's a term that Glanville uses of them in the 70s. They didn't press. They were still using a libero and man marking. So they sort of worked out how to manipulate the ball and how to change positions, but they weren't pressing. So there weren't many Germans in there because German coaches weren't innovative until this wave of Rangnick and Klopp and Tuchel and Nagelsmann. So I mean, clearly there is some level of choice, but I think the actual innovators are pretty clear. I don't think they're that controversial. Yeah,
and I suppose the innovators often are the peripheral coaches as well, right? I even think of someone like Marcelo Bielsa, obviously an innovative coach, but in many respects has always been on the periphery of these sorts of discussions, right?
Yeah, I mean, he is at least pretty well known, and almost despite himself, has sort of projected himself into the mainstream discourse. I think that the interesting people from that point of view, people like Martin Francisco, who nobody in Brazil has really heard of. He appears to be the man who invented the back four. Certainly one of the earliest, one of the pioneers of it. But he was doing it at a team called Nova Via, who never won anything, so nobody really paid much attention. And I think that that's certainly possible, that people were doing slightly unusual things at minor clubs, but they just never sort of invaded the general consciousness. And I think you also got to be very careful that some coaches are just much better at projecting themselves. So I think Alf Ramsey, for instance, is massively undervalued as an innovator because he didn't talk about it. And one of the reasons, and he didn't talk about it for two reasons. A, he was very shy, and it just wouldn't have been natural to him to talk about himself. but also he didn't want other people to know what he was doing. And one of the extraordinary things that Ramsey does is he invents the 4-4-2 effectively. He uses it by mistake because of injury, not by mistake, but it's forced on him in a friendly away at Spain in December 1965. And he thinks, right, that works. And he doesn't use it again until the very last friendly England play before the World Cup, which is in Poland, against Poland in Wrocław. When he brings in Martin Peters and Alan Ball at the same time, so there's no winger. It's a 4-4-2. And it's in Wrocław, so nobody sees it. Nobody really pays any attention to it. And then he doesn't even use it in the group stage. He uses a winger in the group stage because he doesn't want the good teams to see what he's doing. And he finally unleashes it against Argentina. And then the remarkable sort of echo of that is Carlos Bilardo in 1986, who'd worked out the back three worked on this tour of Europe in 1984, which went staggeringly badly for a number of reasons. And so everybody sort of thought, he's using the back three because he just doesn't have any fullbacks. And he's thinking, yeah, that works. Let's hide it away. And he brings it out in the quarterfinal against England. And playing Maradona not really as a 10, but as a second striker. And suddenly Maradona has the platform and has his, 2 brilliant games plus the final.
I want to return to something you've already touched on, actually, with the metaphor of inverting the pyramid. And obviously it offers that really useful framework. But it is a metaphor, and often metaphors can occlude as much as they enlighten. And you've suggested that maybe you were aware of that fact when you were writing the book, that overusing or over-relying on a certain metaphor can have problems. I'm reminded of things like scientists use metaphors all the time to talk about things and then realize that they become unhelpful. So do you think that the inverting the pyramid metaphor actually overshadows some of the tactical developments that take place around the world, or do you think it sort of holds as an overarching direction?
It holds in a very loose sense that we've gone from loads of forwards to loads of defenders, but we seem now to be edging back. I reckon once a week at least I get a tweet or an email or a message, people, it's been reinverted. I know. I also can see. It's a useful title for the book, and it holds in that. Yeah, that shape has gone to that shape, broadly speaking. But you had Victor Maslow talking in the late 60s of the formations like an aeroplane that has to become more and more streamlined. Well, clearly, it's a bit like abstraction in painting or something. That once Malevich has done white square, once you've done a white square and a white background, where do you go? That's an end point. You can't go further than that, and then you have to retreat from it. I think one of the things people say about tactics, which is sort of semi-true but quite misleading, is that they're cyclical. Yeah. And there is an element of truth to that. But each time a cycle comes round, we know what went before. So it's more of a helix than a cycle. And then you get so external events impact on that, or external factors impact on that. So,
it spirals upwards, right? You're constantly building on when you come around this time, you know why it went wrong that time, so you avoid that. And then you get to the antithesis of that thesis. Yeah. And they also know how that thesis became antithetical to the previous antithesis. We've arrived at Hegel, so I'll throw a quote from another philosopher. Okay. But whenever I read Inverting the Pyramid, which I think is testament to how often I go back to it, but I'm always reminded of the quote by Michel Foucault, who talks about the present epoch is an epoch of space. And he wrote this, I think, in 1976. And I'm always made aware of that fact when I'm reading Inverting the Pyramid, because so much of that is about thinking about space. How do we manipulate space? How do we control space? How do we exploit space? And you obviously get to the end of the book, and the question is, how far does that migration go? You talk about even 4-6-0 formations and stuff. And I just sort of wondered that, maybe we've reached the end of that epoch of space, and maybe we need a different metaphor now to talk about football, and wondered if you thought that you had any thoughts about what that metaphor might be moving forward. I
don't know. I still think fundamentally what you're trying to do with tactics is to get your extra man in space and get the ball to him. I think that's just fundamental. And equally, from a defensive point of view, you're trying to stop that. You're trying to shut that down. So I think at the highest level, football will always be the search for space. It's sort of David Winner who really, I think, brought that idea into the mainstream with Brilliant Orange. And he talks about the Netherlands as a nation as being very conscious of space and how they can generate more space with dikes and reclaiming land from the sea. But I read a thing this week that apparently they're now doing that in reverse in the Netherlands because this causes flooding. So there's a whole process of rewilding and sort of letting the sort of sandbanks return. And you sort of think, I wonder if that sort of, I don't think it does have any impact on football. But again, that's the danger of drawing metaphors from one sphere and sort of placing them over something else. But no, I think there will never be a time when having your striker with the ball surrounded by players is a good thing. I just think the ways we generate space change. So one of the ways that we do it now that we absolutely weren't doing in 2008 was a goalkeeper. In fact, he wasn't even allowed to do it. A goalkeeper taking a goal kick 5 yards. And you see that happening right down the pyramid now. And so that sort of panic of the goalkeeper's got the ball or the centre-back's got the ball, just hoof it, get it out. That's just not there. I mean, the goal Sunderland scored against Reading was a brilliant example. I mean, Reading didn't press particularly well, but Sunderland have the confidence to do that. Last year, I went to see Red Star against Ashington, which is seventh tier, and they were passing the ball out from the back. And partly that's for pitch technology, and that's one of those external external factors I was talking about that we now understand how you can. Actually, I don't understand. Some people understand how to put fibres within the pitch, which mean they don't break up, so they don't become quagmires, don't become mud bats. And once that happens, well, you don't have to have a velvety first touch to be able to take your first touch effectively for granted. And obviously, the ball being not this big, uneven leather thing with bits hanging off it, it changes weight during the game, changes mass during the game. And boots being much more delicate, much more receptive. And that, I think, is something Guardiola really benefited from in 2008, that quite apart from the law changes, which meant that smaller players weren't getting bullied out of games, weren't getting physically intimidated, that the playing area got bigger because of changes in the offside law. Also, the equipment was better, and the pitch is better, so you can trust your first touch. And then the game becomes about moving the ball quickly to create the space. Whereas before, there probably was more of a safety first thing of, you don't want the ball rolling to your goalkeeper because it might bobble.
Yeah, I suppose space has become much more phasally based. Everyone thinks about what am I doing in this phase of play? What am I doing in that phase of play? People talk about rest defense. So thinking, even when you're attacking, thinking about the structures that you have defensively to be able to actually control.
Yeah, if we lose the ball, what do we do?
Yeah.
What's our, you attack in a way to ready yourself for a counter-attack. So you're thinking that stage ahead. But I also think in the days when we talked about quite rigid 4-4-2s or 4-3-3s, your formations are almost irrelevant now. Yeah. They're not quite the useful sort of to give you a sort of a brief overview. But in the old days, I mean, 15, 20 years ago, you would get teams who were just 4-4-2 and they wouldn't move out. And just defensively, you want your structure. But now I think we're much more conscious that players need to negotiate their role within the structure. That the structure shouldn't be restrictive. It should be, a framework that you build upon. Sasaki's idea that there are 4 aspects that should determine your position: your teammates, the opposition, the ball, and the space. That seems to be something that should have been obvious for a long, long time, but it only really became obvious after Saki.
Yeah, I'm actually quite interested in the differences now between what we talk about as positional play, whatever people mean by that, but the sort of notion that you have a neutral space and you can talk about the central space and the half space and the wide space, versus what we're seeing a little bit more with pressing teams like Red Bull system teams, where space is a lot more determined about the location of the ball. So you'll press to that location rather than thinking, do we have the structures to attack with players spread around? So maybe different concepts of space is where the next metaphor goes.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. But I think there's always been, not always, but once pressing sort of entered the mainstream, I sort of think that all football can roughly be divided into 2 testaments: pre-pressing and post-pressing. And that coming of systematization maybe rather than pressing, because obviously Catenaccio would fall into systematization. So from the sort of mid-60s onwards, football is a structured team game rather than a game about individuals. And one of the things in the Charlton's book is how different Bobby and Jack saw that. And Bobby, and partly this is a psychological thing, that I think that in the late 50s, in that sort of 18 months between him making his debut and Munich, he referred to that as paradise. And it's him playing this individualistic, very attacking football with his mates, who were, a year, 2 years, his age, or a couple of years older than him. And that must have been an incredibly intoxicating thing. And to be winning the league doing that, and then it's ended by Munich. And he spends his life trying to get back to that. But it's not just that he's lost his mates. It's that style of football disappears as well. And Jack, under Don Revy, I mean, Jack had been on coaching courses. It was him who persuaded Ravi to go to a zonal system at the back. He saw that football was about structures and systems, and Bobby always wanted to be about the individual. And there's an amazing bit in Bobby's autobiography about Ramsey told him in the '66 World Cup final, "You've got to mark Franz Beckenbauer." Beckenbauer was a midfielder in those days, and Bobby sort of said, "Well, can't Nobby Stiles do it?" And Ramsey goes, "No, because Beckenbauer sits very deep, so Nobby can't go that far forward. It's got to be you." And there's this sort of, Bobby talked about lying awake that night, sort of, should I do that? Is that the right thing to do? And he was still wanting to impose his individualistic model. But fortunately for him and for England, he had a sense of duty and a very clear sense of direct authority. I mean, he did after his national service, he said, I think I probably would have done quite well in the army. Well, he probably would have done, because I think he liked having somebody telling him what to do. So Matt Busby, and then Ramsey, and he followed Ramsey's orders and did mark Beckenbauer at the game. And I mean, he was 29 at the time, Beckenbauer was 20, so maybe he'd have dominated him anyway. But you see in 1970 the danger when he wasn't doing that. And at that moment when he loses Beckenbauer in 70 and Beckenbauer strides forward and scores, albeit Benetti mistake. And that's the beginning of the end for Ramsey's England. So that division between systematised and non-systematised football, I think, is profound. But once you then get into systematised football, obviously there are then different modes within that, and whether you press or whether you have a Catenaccio style defence with whether it's man marking with a modified system of zonal marking, and then that pressing, whether it's man oriented, ball oriented, or space oriented, or some mixture. That's where we are now. The people trying to, and I think it's where data is going to be, probably already is hugely important. The problem with talking about data in football is clubs don't tell you how to use it, because that's the arms race at the minute. But in terms of structuring your press, whichever mode of pressing it is, and using data to inform that and make it as sophisticated as possible, and then working out the best way of communicating that to players, that I think is the frontier we're at now.
You got your Old Testament and then the move to the systematized New Testament. What's the move? What's the moment from BC to AD in that?
Well, you can't pinpoint it. It's not as simple as when is the moment when the Old Testament becomes the New Testament? Is it the birth of Christ, or is it Gabriel going to Mary? Or is a useful. I think you can say the '63 European Cup final, when Benfica, who under Gutmann had been this sort of great team of individuals, Gutmann clearly was structuring to an extent, but it was still about getting Mario Calunga or getting Eusebio on the ball. And then Catenaccio, AC Milan's Catenaccio overwhelming that in '63. You can even say the moment where Calunga is felled by Altafini in that game, and whether it was a cynical attempt to injure him or just a slightly late challenge, you can argue about. But you can almost say that is the moment. But it's a symbolic moment, and clearly it differed from country to country, and it didn't go. It's not that it just goes in a straight line. It just wobbles in that. So I mean, you can say that the way Brazil played, particularly to an extent in '58, but certainly '62 under Emerê Moreira, they were using a sort of pretty basic zonal system to facilitate their 4-3-3, and that was a 4-3-3 that was lopsided. It was a 4-2-4, but Zagallo played deep. That you can say is a step towards systematization, and yet that's a world away from what Ramsey did in '66. What you then see in '70 is a step back, because you can't press and you can't play the physicality and the intensity that England did in '66, or the Soviets in '66, or West Germany in '66. You can't do that in the heat and altitude of Mexico. So that allows this final efflorescence of that more individualistic Brazilian style. And you see Brazil know that this is kind of, there's this sort of very odd, at the time every sort of, this is a new frontier for football. And I think partly the fact that it was broadcast via Telstar, and the ball of that tournament is called the Telstar, and it's broadcast in colour for the first time. All of this feels very exciting, and they're clearly capitalising on the moon landings and the space race and all that sort of iconography. The fact that Brazil team had been on a NASA training course before the tournament, all of that makes them look cutting edge. But even in Brazil, they knew that wasn't true. And so by 74, they put some army PT instructor in charge of a team and told them to run more. They knew that 70 was an aberration, a step back. And what appeared to be this new frontier of beautiful football was actually the final flowering of the old football.
Yeah, no, this sounds all fascinating. I could talk about it. There's a lot. It's funny because it feels like we're going through the inverse again now. We've got the elite coaches, all systematizers, and then you've got Carlo Ancelotti's Real Madrid, who are the wonderful team of Galacticos, or however you want to call them, raising questions about how the systems work, right? And the big question is like, can Pep Guardiola win a Champions League with Man City?
But that's when it comes down to humans. I mean, nobody can believe Real Madrid were the best team in Europe last season. It's brilliant to watch them win, well, at least 3 ties. They didn't deserve to win. In the final, they probably did deserve it. But yeah, they were very, very lucky against PSG. They were very, very lucky against Chelsea, and they were very, very lucky against Manchester City. And they were able to do it because they had a goalkeeper in brilliant form, a centre-forward in brilliant form, and a midfield that functions incredibly well, despite having a combined age of about 150. But there still is an element of systematization there. The way that Vinicius works off Karim Benzema, the way that Modric and Kroos and Casemiro set up that midfield. I mean, it's just automatic for them. They know what they're doing. I mean, but Ancelotti's just this very, very strange coach, full stop, that should be sort of very Saki influenced. Doesn't appear to be. And the first man to win the league in each of the 5 major nations. Yeah, he's only ever won it once in each of the 5 major nations, as if he can't generate the intensity to keep that going, to keep that consistency. And so you then sort of think, well, is he just the bloke who comes in after the innovator and sort of just calms everybody down and makes them feel good about themselves and builds on the foundations? But, phenomenally successfully, so you can't really knock it. He will not be appearing in any great detail in future pyramids because he's not an innovator.
Yeah. I think one of the most interesting aspects of the book, and something you touched on as well, is the localism of the book. This is about the transmission of ideas, and I suppose fundamental to that is the notion that you have a place where an idea hasn't reached, and then the idea can pervade that place, that country. That's not happening as much anymore. You touch on it in the epilogue to the second edition, that we are in an age of globalization. Like how do ideas transmit when someone can write a blog post about, I don't know, Fernando Deniz's Fluminense team, and someone can read it 5 minutes later in Mongolia. So it's hard to talk about the transmission of ideas in quite the same way as you've done it in
I mean, clearly that it gets pretty murky. It's sort of all the plasticines lumped into one. It's this horrible brown mess, and I think you end up. The other thing that's changed, not just transmission of ideas, is much quicker. It's that there's a real concentration of talent in one league, to be honest. And maybe a handful of other clubs, and logically that should mean, if you believe all those theories about hubs of knowledge and the reason why the Silk Road sort of led to sort of great developments along its route, which I just do, then the Premier League should be where the vast majority of innovations happen, because it's where we have the best players and the best coaches, and they're constantly going head to head against each other. It's phenomenally exciting for us. I don't think it's particularly healthy for the world.
Do you think that innovation is happening outside of that at all? I mean, it feels to me like in the Premier League, you sort of are hamstrung a little bit by just the amount of sheer talent that you have there. I mean, obviously, tactics is always going to help that, but it feels like there's a very elite brand of tactics if you want to win playing with elite talent and you play in a certain way, whereas there is
there's a truth to that. I just sort of... I'm just not sure it really matters if you... I don't know, you look at something like Bodø Glimt. Obviously, it matters to Norway, it matters to Bodø Glimt, but it's almost like, so what?
Until Sheffield Knutson is brought to the Premier League, it doesn't exist, right? I guess. Pyramid
is pretty self-consciously talking about the elite level.
Yeah.
It's just that the elite level used to be spread over 30 or 40 countries rather than one. You'd like to think that it might make a difference at the World Cup, but I suspect managers don't have enough time wasted. Well, what I'd love is, and this really can only happen in North Korea, but I really love some North Korean genius to work out something totally new and away from any eyes looking at it, develop this sort of unseen brand of football and suddenly unleash it on the world at a World Cup. But I suspect that won't be happening.
So this globalization and the shift to globalization, how does that impact the future of histories of football tactics, do you think?
Well, they get messier. It becomes very difficult. And things just don't, things change much more quickly now. You can't